So we're back, and we're talking about Ivor Miller's article, Creolizing for Survival in the City. In the first little video we looked at, we talked about how this movement begins in the 70s in New York. It seems to involve primarily 12 to 15-year-old adolescent boys or young men, and that some people saw it as art, some people saw it as vandalism, and the essay starts off with a reference to Mayor Ed Koch of New York at the time spending over $1 million trying to remove graffiti from train cars, subway train cars in New York. It was some people saw that as a travesty, others saw it as an absolute necessity. You've got to clean this stuff up. So from Ivor Miller's perspective, he's going to look at all of this as a social science and a historical episode in the history of New York, right? And in the history of art in general. So let's take a look. He talks about creolization as an attitude in this next section. Creolization as an attitude. So we'll define creolization for you as what happens when a new language is created by bringing together two or more languages. Okay? So for him, graffiti in New York is a language, it's a way of communicating. And he thinks it's something very new. He says that this group of young men created a very new way of communicating with one another through the images that they created, right? So, and what he's talking about with regard to all these different groups in New York, these different languages, he'll tell you that in New York, the city of New York itself was socially segregated. It's segregated culturally. It's segregated racially. It was very common, as you know, New York had a great influx of people during the 19th century. We've talked about this, how the population just grew tremendously. And that in the part of that was an immigration influx, that New York was one of those places where people just came from all over the world. In the 20th century, post-World War II U.S., New York, we've got a amazing number of ethnicities in New York. And what seemed to happen traditionally in New York is that when a new group of immigrants came in, or a new group of people came in, they tried to find other folks who were culturally similar to themselves, who maybe even spoke their same language. And so you'll find that pockets of culture develop in New York where people who want to be able to take a nice stroll in their neighborhood and see other people who speak their native language, who put up signs maybe in their shops in the languages that they know, that gives them a lot of comfort. Now they're learning English, to be sure, because they're not going to be able to survive in New York without learning it. But they're going to really work on their English, but the comfort of being able to think and speak and laugh and enjoy your own language typically meant that immigrants from Poland, from Germany, from Ireland, from Jamaica, from Puerto Rico, from Spain, from Mexico, wherever people came in to New York, they tried to group themselves together in these communities. So there is this element of self-segregation, if you will, self-selection into your cultural groups. When we get to the post-World War II era, we're well beyond that great age of immigration into the U.S., and we've gone through 2 world wars, and people start to identify more with being American. Add to that the 60s come along, where we are trying very hard in our society, in our culture, to try to break down barriers of inequality, especially those based on race, right? And gender to an extent at that point, but first and foremost, we're worried about race. So New York itself, already divided, segregated, if you will, into these pockets of culture, was extremely diverse, but not well connected. Add to that, following World War II, and perhaps even before that, there's an extraordinary rise in gang activity. Probably following Prohibition, we get the development of organized crime, and other elements in New York, etc. We don't have time to get into all of that, but gangs themselves do develop. And one of the things that these writers are talking about is how you have these neighborhoods where we're already segregated, if you will, from one another culturally, even physically. We're living in different parts of the city. And then add to that that gangs develop associated with those neighborhoods, with those regions that also sort of keep that territory distinct in a way. So with regard to the movement, if you will, of graffiti, you're going to start to see the writers, and Miller talks about this, they believe that they're breaking down the barriers created by tradition, by immigration, by people wanting to live with people they know, by the influx of gangs who then try to keep that territory also separated into gang territories. And so they believe that when they start to tag, when they start to do their art, their writing, that they're actually cutting across those barriers. They're crossing those, right? So that's one of the big issues that goes on here. If you look on your page 144, no, not 144, sorry. This is one of the writers named Coco 144. This is page 155, sorry. He says in an interview with Miller, the movement for graffiti, broke barriers. We were at a point where after the 50s and 60s, there were the gangs, and you couldn't go into a neighborhood. Neighborhoods were put into pockets like Black Harlem, Spanish Harlem, the Upper West Bronx. This movement, the graffiti movement, is something that broke negative barriers and created unity. It did so many things at one time. It was totally pure. It was totally positive. Our intentions weren't to deface property. It was a call for unity. And that's interesting. At least that's the way this one writer, Coco 144, or COCO 144, this is how he remembers the movement, like being interviewed a couple of decades after the fact. So were they intentionally doing this? I don't know. It is an interesting analysis. We do know for sure that writing groups, and we have, Miller will give you images of them. Miller will give you more discussion on this, that the writing groups, these guys would get together and they would compare notes. They would hang out on subway platforms waiting for the next example to rush by of someone's art. And so they would hang out together on platforms, and then they would get together and say, hey, let's create something. You often were safer in groups because, as we said, this is a dangerous kind of art making. It's fast. And it was sometimes better, easier to do this in a group. So these guys would form writing groups, and these groups would go across color. You'd have white kids, black kids, Hispanic kids, all involved together. One of the writers talks about, oh, there were Polish kids, German kids, all of us connecting. So a real going across the board with regard to all of these guys getting together, comparing notes, and working together. Let's see, on page 156, you have another example that speaks to that. And this is AMRL, Bama. Sorry. A lot of what happened back then cannot be explained easily because it was like a coming together of minds. To me, I always look back and think how amazing it was, because you had a bunch of guys with the same kind of mental attitude going out to do something. When it was really rolling 2 years after it began, we're talking about 3,000 or 4,000 writers that could communicate peacefully all over the city. They shared ideas. That kind of activity was not happening during the time outside of graffiti, right? That kind of activity was happening. There were too many gangs out there, all the madness, yet these cats came out of nowhere, didn't even realize what they were doing, and created a major network in the city, communicating from Brooklyn to Manhattan in a day without the use of a phone. Yeah? So this idea of communication. Miller likes to talk about how the kids might admire a particular tag or a particular image, and then the artist or the writer would sign it. And they would then, if they wanted to tell that writer that they enjoyed their work, they would copy the image and put their own tag next to it and somehow send it back, right, when the train goes back. If the original writer saw that they had sort of imitated or made an homage to their original, then they would sign that work too and send it back. So they were communicating all over the city with this art that they were doing, with these images they were creating. So in this section on, sorry, in this one section about creolizing that Miller comes up with, he's trying to point out that these kids who are doing this art are communicating with each other in a way that they otherwise couldn't do, right? Because of cultural boundaries, because of gang violence. So they're communicating with each other. They have this amazing concept of communicating with each other through these moving trains, through this fast art that they're doing on these trains. They believe, according to the people that Miller is interviewing, they believe that they're breaking down cultural boundaries. They believe that they are getting around gangs with this. They believe that they are creating some kind of unity across the city of New York. So it's an interesting idea that art can do this in a community, that the people's art, public art, grassroots art, that some might consider vandalism, can do this. Yeah? So keep that in mind as we work on to